Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending today's webinar. It's going to be a great discussion. Excited to have you. It's brought to you by Traverse Systems. The focus is going to be data challenges and why supply chain performance is a data problem and how to solve it. You're going to get some great tips and tricks on how to solve the data problem and take your supply chain performance to the next level. A few notes before we get started to make the best use of your time. All in, probably about 45 minutes. We do these every month, and that's typically where we're at. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of the session. If you have any questions for our panelists today, you'll see a Q&A box. Just type them in, click submit. We'll get to as many of them as we can towards the end of today's webinar. If you look at the icons along the bottom of your screen, you'll see some different ones that enable you to do a few different things. You can share this socially. I want you to focus on that resource icon. Traverse Systems is hosting some outstanding content related to supply chain and supply chain performance within that, as well as a recent on-demand webinar. You can click on that, download that at your leisure. And we are recording today's session. So if you missed it, if you joined us, regardless, you're going to have access to the on-demand version. So be on the lookout for that in the next 24 hours. Wanted to briefly introduce the team today. We've done a lot of these together, know them well. They're going to do an outstanding job. We've got Greg Holder. Greg is the co-founder and CEO at Traverse, and he is joined by Richard Wiljum. Richard runs the sales and marketing team at Traverse Systems, and then Kip Kapelke is their lead sales engineer. These guys do a fantastic job. They're a great team. You're going to get a lot of value out of what they have to say, so be ready for a great presentation. Without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Richard. Richard, take it away.
Thank you, Jason. Good afternoon to those in our audience today. On behalf of Greg, Kip, and myself, I'd like to thank you not only for your time, but for your interest in our session today. Jason, as we talked about in our last session, heard a great quote at the RELA conference, and that was, supply chain is a data problem. And I got to tell you, that has been banging around in my head ever since. Particularly as it applies to the value that we add to our customers. So I thought what we'd do today is just kind of further expound on that concept. For those of you that attend trade show webinars or keep up in the supply chain press, you know that machine learning and AI is the latest and greatest savior of supply chain. But as you see in this recent Gartner study, that 95% of the companies agree that they need to be able to make decisions in real time, but that 93% of them are dealing with disconnected systems. So that makes that use case not only difficult, the AI machine learning use case difficult, but almost impossible to solve. So frankly, this quote came as a surprise to us because Traverse Systems as a company has been aggregating data from core execution systems to provide a unified view of the supply chain from our customers since 2000. And that is the only way that you're able to make real-time decisions is when you do that. So for those of you in the audience today with that 7%, congratulations, you know the value of what a connected supply chain will do for you. For those of you in the audience that are in the 93% and are still on your journey, we've kind of architected the presentation today to speak to that, and we believe you're going to get a great deal of value out of it. So again, on behalf of the entire Traverse Systems team, I'd like to thank you for your participation today. Jason, back to you.
Thanks, Richard. So Greg, going to start with you. As a former practitioner with a ton of experience in the space and now a service provider for a long time, in your experience, data is a huge challenge. What makes it so hard for most companies, for those, for that 93%?
Well, that's fairly simple. And if you look at this slide, it explains it very clearly. And that is because the data that lives and breathes in these customers' organizations are all siloed in these execution systems. So if you think about it, the purchase order information is running around in that purchase order system. the receiving data is in a WMS system. While it does hold some purchase order information, but it's primarily a receiving function. And another thing on top of that, a lot of WMSs don't keep data for a whole long time. So there might only be data there for 30 or 60 days before sending it to another system. Thinking about a TMS system, it has a little bit of purchase order information, but it really is there to execute the routing request and to provide routing to the supplier community. So this data lives and breathes in all of these different execution systems. For those that are trying to pull the data out, a lot of times that's a manual pull. So data also lives and breathes in Excel spreadsheets and in Access databases. Mine in former life, 24 years ago, we would do extracts from different systems and try and put them into databases just to get some insight into that information. And then at that point, it becomes stale at some point and too many hands in the pot. So it becomes difficult to understand. And there's just, everybody has their own Excel spreadsheet. So from that perspective, it's just siloed data and it's not easy for companies to get to. And I think that's the biggest problem for those 93%.
Richard, Kip, anything to add to that on your end?
Yeah, I just to echo, I think Greg's comments of, where do you go to see all the different aspects that impact the supply chain from, origin to final destination. Having a place to go to see all that information or collect data against it, I think, having this aggregated component is awesome. I'll show some stuff later on some of the screens and things that I used to use pretty much exclusively to really help drive those conversations with internal and external business partners. But I'm going to take another twist here for just a second. In my past life and where I came from, there was data purges and just files and things were kept for so long that they ended up having a 13-month time frame. Emails would get wiped out. If I didn't remember to save my favorite spreadsheet with some historical information, that would disappear. What I love about Traverse Systems is we hold 7 years worth of your information. So having that year-over-year type comparison, see those true trends over a longer period of time, both how it impacts your internal business partners as well as that vendor community. I can't stress enough how appreciative I was using the Traverse Systems platform back in the day to be able to go back and see that level of information for a number of years. So invaluable in my opinion.
Awesome. So, Greg just highlighted some challenges, and obviously we're talking about data and supply chain performance today. So for the team, how do the challenges that Greg highlighted, how do they have a direct impact on supply chain performance? Can you guys expand on that a bit?
Sure, I have a couple of examples. First and foremost, visibility from systems provides the insight to what is actually happening. If you don't have visibility, it's hard to fix something that you can't see. So point number one. Point number two, if companies are bringing data from these execution systems, let me back up for a second. And I get an opportunity to speak before buying organizations many times. And on time and in full is really something that the buying organizations are very, very big on. And one of the questions I like to ask is, if you know that your vendor was shipping you at 70%, would you change the way you ordered from that supplier? And in every case, you start to see the nods in the audience, and then the next question is, okay, well, how does that would the 70% fill rate affect your sales plan, or does it affect your sales plan? Of course, now you start to see them nodding and discussing and talking amongst themselves. So then you turn around and you ask what the fill rate performance is of the vendors that they deal with, and inevitably they're all telling us that they have a 97% or a 99% or 100% fill rate, and we know for doing this 20 years that that's just not the case. And just because of experience of the last 20 years, it's not the case, because a lot of things are happening that maybe the buying organization doesn't even know. And the best example of that is something I already mentioned. So when purchase orders are in purchase order execution systems, receipts are in receiving execution systems, well, at some point those things come together. And if you're with a buying organization or a retail organization that has an open to buy, at some point beyond when that purchase order, they don't believe anything's going to be shipped anymore. They cancel the purchase order. It might cancel all of the open items on that purchase order, making the open quantity on the PO look like the receiving quantity. So now your fill rate is 100%. And that is one reason why buying organizations think they get 100% of what is ordered. And so one of the things that we've learned over the last 20 years, there's several things you have to do. You have to understand how and when data changes and why data changes. And then at some point you need to understand, if we want to really understand what's happening in our inbound supply chain, we need to make some intelligent decisions. And you get that by being involved with the data at every level in every organization. And the way we found the best way to do it is to bring it into one location. So take the data out of these separate silos and put them in one place where you can have insight and visibility to that.
It's that single version of the truth, right? That Richard alluded to at the beginning.
Yeah,
it's huge. Kip, what's your take on the challenges that Greg highlighted and their impact on supply chain performance?
Yeah, I think to quote Richard, where am I winning and losing? How do I quickly see some of that information? So it's one thing to have 7 years worth of data, and maybe if you've got a vision, you know what you want to do, it's nice to have the data and you can slice and dice it any way you like. Or you can have some predetermined scoreboards, scorecards. We've got lots of different data visualization type tools. We built some really great custom scorecards, and it's very easy to see, especially those folks that give some sort of a letter grade or a score. You can see very quickly who's winning, who's losing, and who do I want to then go after and try to fix that the biggest supply chain issues, right? The 80-20 rule. What are the couple of things that are causing the biggest disruptions in that supply chain? And how do we go, taking that one bite at a time, how do we go after that as a good dialogue or good discussion with, in my past life, I was a supply chain, executive, and I would work internally with our merchant or product development partners. But at the same time, I would help them have a conversation with the vendors that are causing any of those disruptions. So I think just having some of that visualization available, again, that single version of the truth, everybody's looking at the same scorecard. You can't slice and dice it any different way, and get a different answer. It is what it is, and everybody talks to that same thing. So I think it's phenomenal to have that.
Richard, what's your perspective on it?
So from my perspective, and whether you're a grocer, a manufacturer, or a traditional retailer out there, your information has a shelf life. And for example, if you're receiving ASNs after the receipt, well, what good is that going to do? And getting back to the subject of data quality, let's say if you're a company that receives based upon that ASN, if you could either understate your inventory, which is terrible, or overstate your inventory, not quite as terrible, at least you have the merchandise, but it's still a challenge. So that data quality and receiving it on a timely basis is everything to these companies.
Fantastic.
I'll take that next, Jason. I want to take that a next step further because sure. Richard just hit on my other soapbox. My first soapbox is on time and in full, and my second soapbox is data accuracy. And to extend that just a little bit to an organization that uses ASNs, and they have mixed SKU ASNs, and they're in a flow environment. So they're using ASN actually to receive the product, and they're using ASN to book inventory. And if they're not doing an audit of any of those ASNs, or maybe they did an audit when they first started doing business with a vendor, but they deemed them a gold or a certified vendor and stopped doing the audits on those vendors, that concerns me very, very much, because there's a lot of things that, first and foremost, let's talk about an accurate ASN. It's not necessarily just about being on time. It is important for it to be on time. It needs to be there before you get there. But an accurate ASN, also the measurement or the calculation, the math behind it is, or the business reasons behind it is, you have to take, you compare what the vendor is telling you they are shipping you to what they actually shipped you. So a good process for that is to scan the outside, the carton label, the label on the outside of the carton, and scan the contents. Let a machine do the comparisons to compare overs and shorts and the like that. Why that is one of my soapboxes is because I don't believe people do enough audits, and I think that that causes poor inventory. So you're not only going to receive that ASN, you're booking inventory as if you receive that product, you're paying invoices as if you receive that product. But if what is in the carton or on the pallet or in the truck is not what was actually on the ASN, then there's giant risk for inaccurate inventory. We saw this personally when I worked at Dillard's for years and years, and where we went to the fact that we just started scanning every piece so that we could account for inventory accurately. But you could tell when you did a physical inventory in a store, you can tell how bad your inventory is off, because once they promote the inventory to the system, automatic orders generate to refill their order levels to where the inventory machines think that needs to be. So it's just one step and one process, but something that's very important.
We're going to stick with you real quick. We talked about a single version of the truth, and organizations have data in 20 different places, maybe more. Why is that single version of the truth that we're harping on today? Why is it so important, Greg?
Everybody on this listening today, and anybody watching the recording afterwards, must be very thankful for Bill Gates and Microsoft products. And now Google has their own spreadsheets. But what that does is allows us to get things done from a business perspective that the software that we work with from an execution perspective does not meet. What that also means is that every department can have their own version of the truth. So in my days with Stage Stores, people would come to meetings and they'd all be talking about the same thing, but everybody would have just different numbers. And who are you going to believe? So one of the things we learned from being practitioners is we needed to have data brought into this one place to get to that single version of the truth. Without that, you're spending meetings time, the whole entire meeting, trying to determine whose numbers we're going to look at, and then you want to have a meeting. So you don't have a meeting before that. One single version of the truth is so very important in this process.
So Kip, no, that's great. So Kip, from your days in the trenches as a practitioner, what does it mean to you? Why is it so important when you were dealing with your vendors?
I think you remove some of the subjectivity out of it, right? So, I mean, data is data. And, some of the things that Greg mentioned, it's much nicer to present, facts, not fiction. So I started out in the buying offices. I moved over to a vendor compliance role and then did some time with vendor services and merchant services. So I've worked in several different aspects of it. And from the time that I started in the buying office, we had supply chain expectations and, per the requirement guide and just the contracts and things that were signed, I knew right away what the expectations were. So from a buying inventory management, and looking at those scorecards, I was able to utilize that information to have great dialogue. And then as I migrated from, the buying world over to supply chain, I started working and sharing that concept with as many, buying and product development partners as I could. And just, again, having everybody speaking that same language. So whether it's a supply chain person talking to an operations folks with the vendor, or it is the buying team talking directly with a salesperson, they're all hearing that same information. And, depending on how you have it configured, pick those one or two things that are most important, that are driving the biggest disruptions, tackle those first. Once you get that figured out, however long that takes, then you start moving on to the next biggest thing. So it made it incredibly easy to have that dialogue. And, some of the information that we were able to provide, was able to make my buying teams look like logistics rock stars, even though they didn't necessarily do it day in and day out, by providing them that solid data and information. They could have fantastic discussions with their vendors and try to get product in, right? I mean, right stuff at the right place at the right time is ultimately where everybody's trying to drive, for sales and margin. Without this in place, it's a lot harder to ensure that that's happening.
Yeah, speed and then increased performance, which brings us to you, Richard. I mean, what's your thought on it?
So the best way I can describe it, Jason, is the speed of trust. And I'd like to be able to take credit for that quote. I can't. It was a book by Stephen M.R. Covey back in 2008. Both Greg and Kip, as former operators, can tell you those meetings arguing over whose spreadsheet was correct probably took years off their lives. And that was just the internal ones, okay? Then you got to go to your trading partners, your vendors, your suppliers, et cetera, okay? and then argue over whose spreadsheet's there. So when everyone is looking at that agreed upon, that single version of the truth, people can make decisions quicker. When everyone's looking at a common data set, typically decisions get made faster, and they're off to the next challenge. So it just accelerates the entire process when that ambiguity of data is taken away.
Perfect. So Greg, explain a little bit how Traverse, I mean, you guys have been in the game for a while, how you help companies leverage data today and solve their supply chain problems and improve the performance that we're talking about.
Certainly will. So I wish I could say we were brilliant and began and had this grand vision of how this stuff would work. It was actually much more tactical approach. So in former lives, had the opportunity to see how poor vendor performance could affect merchandise moving through the distribution center. So I'm an industrial engineer by education, and spent a lot of time working in distribution centers for both Dillard's and Stage Stores I mentioned before. When we landed at Stage Stores 25 years ago, they had just doubled in size via acquisitions. They still only had one distribution center, but 700, 800 stores. Merchandise was going all over the place. You had Green Bay merchandise in Dallas markets, and Dallas Cowboys merchandise in Green Bay markets, and it was just an amazing situation. So we had to kind of step back. How do we approach this? We controlled the things that we could control, and that was what was happening within the four walls of the distribution center. Very, very simple. So we hired a bunch of auditors and spent a ton of money just auditing and changing processes within the organization that we could control. Then beyond that, how purchase orders get written, how allocations happen with purchase orders. You can't control that because they don't report to you, but you can gather the data and present that to them. Next. Then the very next thing, it was we still had problems, but what was happening, and we didn't understand as we were working peeling the layers of the onion, or trying to get some of that low-hanging fruit. We turned our attention to the vendor community, and we really identified that there are things that were happening that we couldn't control from a vendor perspective. We weren't doing a very good job of communicating it, and that was really the foundation of what became back then Compliance Networks. We've since rebranded as Traverse Systems. So in 20 years ago, when Traverse Systems was founded as Compliance Networks, we really had a very tactical plan, and that was we wanted to eliminate any of the inbound problems from a supplier perspective, so that we wouldn't have to deal with them in a distribution center, so that merchandise could flow through that distribution center and get to the stores so that it could be sold and bought and sold. And quite honestly, we had a vision for a company and a software product that would solve this. And that software product, which is now the platform, we wanted to do three things. We wanted to automate the identification of the problems that we wanted to communicate. In this arena, there's chargebacks that also, it's a penalty to the vendor community. We want to automate the calculation of that penalty. It's easy if it's a $100 fine. It's easy if it's a $500 fine. It's a little bit more difficult if it's a percentage of a purchase order. It's a little bit more difficult if there's minimums and maximums, a number of units, or the difference between what is, from a cost value, what is ordered and what is received. That starts to become tricky. We knew that we could program a machine to do that. The third thing we wanted to do was we wanted to automate the communication of those failures. We believed that if we could get that evidence in front of the supplier community, then they would be incented to go and change processes, and we'd solve all the problems in the inbound supply chain. So very naive. Let's dive into the first one, which is really the purpose of us being here, and that was, how do you identify, or how do you identify the supply chain problems with a machine? So we wanted to automate that process so that we didn't have to have people doing that. Well, taking a step back, what are the different execution systems that suppliers use? And so if we know that purchase orders exist, talked about those. We know that receipts exist, talked about that. We know that there's ASNs and transportation files. And we said, okay, If we want to measure fill rate, what do we need? We need purchase order information. We need receiving information, and we need it at the item level. If we want to measure on time, we need to know when something arrived or when it was picked up. And so with that, we decided, hey, well, we want to control this data. Let's have our customers write some, simple ETL process. 20 years ago, it's ETL process: extract, translate, and load. So they'd extract it, throw it over the fence to us. We'd translate it, and load it into our own proprietary systems. Manage the data that way. That way, it always looks the same. We can control and set up business rules, and with that, we can write the algorithms that looks at what was ordered versus what was received. We could look at when it was expected to be there, when did it actually get there. And honestly, Jason, what we didn't understand was, wow, we've just now built this supply chain data warehouse. And while we call it a vendor performance management solution, I think a better way to say it is it's a supply chain performance solution. Because if we, at the end of the day, and I didn't mention it a little bit, but we were really focused on the vendor mistakes. But what we've seen over the last 22 years is that there's a lot of people that are accountable. We know that if the purchase orders can be written in such a manner that makes it impossible for a supplier to ever even meet an expectation. So what we tell prospective customers is we put buying organizations, your distribution centers, and your vendors all in a glass house. You're going to see everything that's happening, and you have to be ready for that. And a lot of times we run into distribution center operators that have bones in their closet, and they're not ready for us to come in there because they've been hiding bad processes or just bad processes that they don't want people to see. And we're not trying to get a vendor in trouble. We're not trying to get a buying organization in trouble. We're not trying to get a distribution center in trouble. We're not trying to get a carrier in trouble. What we're trying to do is solve problems in the supply chain and make and help orders flow from point of creation all the way through to consumption, whether consumption is in a distribution center, consumption is in a store on a shelf so a customer can come in and pick it up. So that's product number one, and how we kind of address that. I'll go faster on the other ones in the interest of time. Our second product is a product we call Rivet. It's a business process automation tool. And that's okay. Go ahead and we can talk about Vision.
Well, I know you wanted to talk about Vision because it's so not to interrupt you, but the market is flooded with visibility solutions right now, and you guys are really looking at supply chain visibility through a different lens than others. And I'm excited to hear you talk a little bit about that because it is truly different.
Yeah, thank you for that. Vision, yes, Vision is our third product, and the exciting thing about Vision, and its genesis is kind of with kind of going back to the platform. Our customers came to us and said, "You have this data from all these execution systems. Why can't we just get it in real time? And why would you not want to create a visibility solution for us and eventually a supply chain control tower?" So we've been building this for, I guess, about the last 2 years. We're live, our first customer, and a lot of people are excited about it. And to answer your question, why would we want to go do a visibility solution when you have everybody out there talking about their visibility solutions? The big guys you hear about, Project 44s and the FourKites. You have EDI companies talking about the visibility that's provided with EDI. You have transportation carriers talking about that. All of that is visibility, but it's all still siloed, right? We talked about silo earlier. If that data is siloed, it's hard to get to, and it deals only with a group. What happens if you have vendors that aren't on EDI? And if we go back to the Project 44s and we go back to the FourKites that are trying to bring this data together, I think they get it all wrong there too. So because of our background and our experience, everything begins with the purchase order. That purchase order creation is when the visibility should begin. And I don't care if it's not going to ship. It might ship next week or it might ship 180 days from now because it's also a make-build product. But it begins with that purchase order creation. And at that point, we're looking for this. We're looking for things to happen. And when we hit milestones and something didn't happen, then that begins to introduce risk to our supply chain. So we go to great lengths to understand the things, the milestones, when things should happen, and when they don't happen, then that begins. Hey, this purchase order is now at risk. We either get a machine involved to try and figure out what is happening, or we get people involved. So Vision is kind of like the platform. We're bringing data from all those other things. What makes it different is it's actually a true real-time, built from a real-time foundation cloud product that we're very excited about, multi-tenant. But the most amazing thing, we learned a lot when we were building the platform and how to relate data that a lot of times people don't think is relatable, right? And so when you think about that perspective, you think about let's think about a bill of lading or an ASN. ASN is tied to a purchase order. We're very purchase order centric, but bill of lading may not. And if we're tracking an inbound shipment, how do we associate that bill of lading to the purchase order? So we have processes that use data elements that are always running within Vision that is looking to enhance or fill in missing blanks from different data sources, or do the linkages that a lot of companies don't understand. So that makes it very, 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 very exciting. When we talk about Vision, and we talk about we talk about, you see on this slide, good, better, best. We talk about, hey, visibility solutions. If you want to have the best solution, then these are all the kind of the data elements that you're looking for. You could also label this slide from a good, better, best. It could be crawl, walk, run. So with purchase order information and transportation TMS data, you're in the crawling stage, but you still have the opportunity with that data to identify potential risk, right? And to try to work towards eliminating that risk. And then as you go down, as you start to layer in more data sources, you move into the better category. And then the best category is as much data as you can from PO creation all the way to store scan. And in some cases might be store scan on the back dock or store scan all the way to the shelf. And then your buying organization. Oh, one other thing I want to say about Vision. Vision is unique as well because from my perspective, we're not building it for the supply chain expert. We're building it for the people that care about supply chain. And nobody really understood or knew that they needed to care about supply chain in the last 3 years of the pandemic, right? And now buying organizations are very involved in supply chain, maybe to a point that old DC operators and transportation people maybe don't want them in. And if that's the case, you guys need to call us, because visibility answers all the questions that you guys are having to answer today from a phone perspective and an email perspective. But Vision is really built to give buying organizations what I call a casual user answers to their questions in real time. Let me talk real quick, briefly. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm
no, it's great.
Entire conversation, but I want to share with you one last product that I'm most excited about, and it's our middle product. It's if you're a parent, you have 3 kids, your first one is really and your last one, but the middle one always kind of gets left out. And in this case, the middle one is my favorite from a parenting perspective, I guess. It's a product that we call Rivet. It's a business process automation tool, and the exciting thing about that is it's being introduced as to our customers primarily as a vendor onboarding tool. If we think about that process from a retail perspective, when a buyer decides they want to buy from a new vendor that we've never done business with before, they bring them in. Hey, we need them to understand what it's like to do business with us. And there's a whole lot of people that try to explain that. The buying organization is probably doing some of the deal. Then you have an administrative information that's trying to do the contract work, legal work. You have accounts payable that are trying to make sure all those things are intact. You have your EDI group that's now working with their EDI group. You have a TMS, your transportation group is trying to onboard them from a TMS perspective. You have your vendor relations group is trying to help them understand what it's like to be a vendor and what they need to do from a shipping performance perspective to ship product to us. And that has all been, guess what? It's all been done with siloed different departments within organizations. And we built Rivet so that all those different departments could continue to do their thing with the vendor, but it's all enveloped in one software application. So the vendors that go through this process, you know, that they're all learning the same thing. They're all completing the same forms. They're all getting the same opportunity to be successful. And the exciting thing about this is that as customers are look into and use Rivet, they find any process within their organization that is standardized and has to follow, you know, step by step. Want to make sure that things happen at a certain time, or time sensitive, or things that need to happen repeatedly. That's why we built the Rivet product. And what they're seeing is they can apply it in a whole lot of different areas within organizations. While all these solutions, the platform, supply chain visibility, vision, and Rivet work independently of each other, they are best from an interdependence. And let me give you an example of interdependence. For example, the platform has a very, very strong trouble process. So if anybody has a warehouse where they create orders and receive orders, they know that if something is received that's not ordered, or if we've received more of a product than what has been authorized on the purchase order, that interrupts the flow of that product. So we call that a trouble. A lot of times that has to be set aside, where we have to get somebody outside of the four walls of a distribution center involved to give us an answer of what we want to do. If we create a new purchase order, or if we change order quantity in the case of an overage, then that happens and the product flows. Well, what happens if the buyer's overbought and they decide they don't want the overage? Then they want to return it to the vendor. Well, a good example of an interdependent product is the trouble now is a return to vendor, and it sends an API notice to Rivet, and Rivet handles the return to vendor process from that point until it actually gets received to the vendor. So that's just a process that needs to be handled, an example of a process that needs to be handled the same way every time through completion. And that's why I'm really excited about Rivet, because it's not only good for retail organizations, but anything beyond retail and just about any other industry in the United States. All right, so I've talked for a long time. Let me, I'm going to take a breath and see if Richard, Kip, or maybe Jason, you want to comment.
Thanks, Greg. Great rundown of the product suite that Traverse is bringing to market, how different it is than those other solutions out there. Kip, I wanted to move over to you. We talked about how, obviously, you were a practitioner. You spent a number of years at Kohl's. Can you give the folks out there just a few examples of how you leverage data to your advantage?
Absolutely, Jason. You know, some of the things, there's so much data, it can almost be overwhelming. So, you know, as much as I love the analysis screens, I was utilizing those for an awfully long time in order to be able to drill down into, you know, the crazy different details that I wanted to see. But at a very high level, you know, what do you do with all that data and all that information that is out there? You know, some of the things that I see are most popular, and we had a really robust and awesome customized scorecard when I left. You know, what you're seeing on the screen here it's similar to some of the things we had, or at least has a couple of those components. But the things that I think are most important, and I try to strive when I talk to others about, you know, building a good scorecard, is having a letter grade. A letter grade in the score really allows you to quickly identify, you know, am I winning or losing? Because obviously, if you're an A or a B vendor, you're doing things very well as far as supply chain is concerned. If you're D or an F, you probably have a couple of opportunities out there. To make it even easier is, you know, in addition to that letter grade, somebody that comes in new from outside the organization, or, you know, a different industry comes in as a buyer, they can look at that scorecard. That letter grade is very telling to be the first place to look. But then they're like, okay, there's a lot of great information on here. Where do I go next? What do I even look at? You know, some folks are starting to put in speed impediments. So how do you predetermine which rules are the ones that impact speed through that supply chain? How can you identify those top three? Because that's your, you know, back to that 80-20 concept again, of what are the ones that are causing you 80% of your grief? Well, those are going to be the ones that have either the highest, you know, quantity or magnitude of issues, and it's spelled right out in that top three speed impediment. So it was kind of fun that used to be able to have great conversations with new buyers in the company, hand them a scorecard and be like, you look up in this upper right-hand corner, you look down here in this other corner, and you have enough to be able to talk to sales and operations within that vendor community and say, here's where I want you to, fix it first. And in the event that that vendor doesn't know how to fix it, that's when you bring in your supply chain partner and say, hey, let's look at this same scorecard. Can you help the vendor and the operation community, think of ways that they can resolve or fix these issues before they ship some of the next shipments to us? So just love the fact that, what are you doing with all that information? Let's make it very consistent and have a one-stop shop to be able to provide that information. So scorecards are great. Another thing that's on the screen is just some of the standardized data visualization. So absolutely ways that you can look at it. And then the screen that you're presenting now is an analysis screen. So in addition to having that, me as a practitioner on the supply chain side, I love having this level of details, and I joke about it and I call it a pivot table on steroids, but I can run this thing for a couple of years. I can get that year-over-year comparisons. I can start to slice and dice this thing by GMM, DMM, different aspects of the hierarchy. I can get all the way down to a department level. In some of my analysis screens, I can get all the way down to the SKU level if you're that interested in that level of detail. I can see how it's impacting, my internal buying teams. I can see how it's impacting things, or which vendors are causing me that big grief. So it's a great starting place. Once you kind of take a look at that scorecard and say, this is a vendor or somebody that I want to have, a conversation with to try and improve, where do I get some of these details? That's where the experts start to come in and help partner with you. And, we aggregate all that data. We have it all available. We teach you how to utilize it so that you can make really great decisions that ultimately will, put the right stuff in the right place at the right time. So those are probably my two favorite things as I prepared for this and look back on it, that I thought we did really well and had lots of great discussions. And actually, we turned a lot of vendors into A or B vendors. And it's fun to see that they continue to add certified vendors, which is like the top of the top, to where we don't even audit product as it comes into the facilities anymore. We just know that they're that darn good. Product just flows. So it's really neat to see the conversations and things that are had because of that.
Kip, Jason, Kip, that's very well. I have a comment I'd like to add to this. Sure. Because when we're building this product, when we discovered that we had a wealth of information, then we started looking at what kind of information can we present, and Kip highlighted several of it. But one thing I wanted to point out is that we have customers that will use, when they have vendors come to visit, they will use these screens to show them what their fill rate is. And so they can, for any time period at the department level or any level, basically, that the vendor would like to see it, they can present it, and it's interactive. So they're in a conference room together. Well, now they're probably on a Teams meeting, but interactively they're looking at it and they say, hey, can we see it this way? Can we see it for this date range? Or we have several vendors, so can we group all the vendors together and look at it? And it's fascinating to hear about the stories that they talk about related to the information that we've provided that it really enhances the business relationship. Again, getting back to that one version of the truth and easy access to that data, so that you spend less time worried about the data and more time trying to solve problems.
Awesome. Thanks, Kip. That's some great examples from your time over at Kohl's. We appreciate that. Richard, wanted to hand it over to you real quick so you can tell the folks out there the best way to get in touch with Traverse.
Thank you, Jason. I just wanted to summarize. Greg and Kip talked about our 3 different solutions, but I just want to make everyone aware that we at Traverse Systems have one product, and that is improving supply chain performance. We have 3 solutions that help them achieve that. What those 3 solutions have in common, number 1 is they all aggregate data from core execution systems. Number 2, they share that data with stakeholders, both internal and external. And number 3, they drive supply chain behavioral change. So again, one product with 3 different solutions to achieve that. Love to talk to those in the audience today that would like to learn more. Either give Barry a ring at barry@traversesystems.com, give us a call the old-fashioned way, or if not, we have a contact form on traversesystems.com. Back to you, Jason.
Awesome. So we had a lot of questions coming in from the audience. We want to get after them. If you haven't sent in your questions yet, there's still time. We're just going to take a few, though. If we don't get, we have a few already in the queue. If we don't get to yours, Greg or Richard or Kip will reach out directly to you. But Richard, I wanted to start with you before we actually take a question from the audience. I have a question that wasn't fully addressed, but it was a great start to the conversation today. That Gartner stat, 93% know what they need to do, right? Or know that they want real-time decision-making ability, real-time visibility. They want a single version of the truth, all that good stuff. But only 7% of them have the necessary tools in-house to do that. That's a it's a shockingly small number. What do you think why is that number so small? Why are only 7% of companies actually investing in bringing the tools in-house to get the visibility and the real-time decision-making ability that they need to take their supply chain performance to the next level? What's going on there?
Jason, that's a great question. And at the beginning of the session, I said I was surprised at that statistic. Actually, I'm flabbergasted by it, because that is an insanely low number. Honestly, and I've run into this over the years working with executives at companies, there isn't the support at the senior executive level. That is crucial to not just projects like this, but any projects. But I can tell you the landscape has shifted tremendously in the last 3 to 4 years. Everybody's talking about customer-centric supply chains, meeting the customer at the point of impact, whether it's on their phone, whether it's in the store, whether it's online, or whether it's on social websites. It doesn't matter anymore. And in order to accomplish that, you have to have a responsive real-time supply chain where you can make decisions. So we're already seeing that companies are taking a second look at this and have decided that in order to execute, they need this ability. So we expect that 7% to rise here in the very near future.
Yeah, I would think so. So we had a question coming in from James, and James says, if I don't have the Traverse Systems solution, where do I start? So that sounds like a team question. So whoever wants to take that one.
That's a tough question. Let me add, as I think about that, let me add something to Richard's statement. I think a lot of it has to do, Jason, companies, senior executives, when you make big decisions like that, there's a lot of risk involved. And a lot of times they're probably worried about getting fired if something doesn't go right. And that's another thing I would, I guess, mention about our organization. We remove a lot of the risk just by the way our business models work. So that should help. Where do I get started if I don't have your system? So thinking about that, I would two things come to mind. I think that thing number one is what data do you have access to, available data? So that's probably the first step. So start to list those out. I think the second thing is where do you suspect the problems are? So is it on your inbound supply chain from a transportation perspective? Is it something that's happening in your distribution center? Is it a process that's within your area of control? So you remember the story that I talked about where we had problems in our distribution centers, but we own the distribution centers, and so they were easy for us to identify and solve. So start there. Start with the data that you have. Start with the where you think the problems are. Get some small wins. So you're wanting to show how you're having a positive impact, positive effect on the business, and then you can grow from there with some small wins. You get some people on your side, and they can help you take it to the next level.
Fantastic.
I think to add to that, Greg, just really quickly is, having some sort of requirements guide or some sort of things that your expectations from either transportation, dates and timelines and expectations of, routing behaviors and stuff, whether it's prior to a start ship, prior to a cancel date, 48 hours before you can ship it. I think starting to put those requirements on paper and having that expectation that's standardized across everybody, I think is another great place to start. Because I think even before you can do much of anything with us, that's kind of that precipice or stuff that has to be identified so that we can then help support it from a reporting and capturing standpoint.
Jason, if I could just add to this, I spoke to a well-respected vendor earlier this week, and although he's not directly a customer, he gets outputs from our system, and he told me what he liked most about our system was that if he has a problem in one of his many distribution centers, he knows about it right away, and he can fix it. In the past, he told me that if he had a problem, sometimes it took 6 months and a memo from his credit department saying he had a problem. And the comment that he made was, I just bled for the last 6 months because I didn't know what the problem is. To that person out there that asked the question, as Greg indicated, take that data, but share it with your stakeholders so they can affect change. Don't keep it to yourself, share it.
Thanks, Richard. And we're going to take one more question, and I think it's the perfect question to end on. It's from Kim. And Kim, we're going to let you have it since we're talking about data so much. You're the data guy, and we talked about how you leverage data to your competitive advantage at Kohl's. Kim says, our data is a mess. How do I normalize it? Kip, why don't you expand on that? Kind of a loaded question.
It is a little. I think we at least alluded to in the last question kind of how you can do it internally, but I would strongly encourage taking a look at a solution like the Traverse platform, because we will do some basic things in the initial discussions and start working on collecting data from just core data, so just vendor information, site, departments, item level type details. Get us that starting point of what all you're working with. Add in PO information. So I think Greg said it earlier, PO header and details, receiver information, TMS routing type information. If we can start collecting that, think back to that good, better, best strategy, the more we can kind of get, the better you can start pulling that in. And, once you start collecting it, then we can start talking about what that scorecard looks like for you and what are the things that are most important that you can aggregate and pull together and have it spit something out automatically and standardized so that everybody's looking at that same thing. Once you do that, we then also talk about what rules can be automated on your behalf. So, we talked about fill rates and late shipments, and you come to us and tell us, here's the thresholds and here's what's important to me from timing perspectives. We have the foundation. We then can detect and things in real time, so back to Richard's point, wanting to get this information out to that vendor community as quickly as possible, we'll internalize it. We'll do the math for you. We'll, convert that into a communication out to that vendor. And it's amazingly quick as far as what we're doing, things that are happening, sometimes same week, they're getting that notification of an issue. And then on top of the automated ones, I think those are easy and fun to put together. But then what other things are causing those pinch points or disruptions as product is coming into either a warehouse or a distribution center or even into the store? So, help us help you capture and identify those pinch points so that you can come back and have even more information on the back end to report against. So how do you normalize it? I think get it all into that one-stop shop so that we, somebody like a Traverse can help aggregate it and make it make sense, and then start building robust, score cards or reports and things that you can do something with that information on the back end. And as we've mentioned kind of several times throughout today, everybody's looking at that same bit of information, and you can't really, it's not subjective anymore, right? You want data to talk and be objective. And I think that's what we do really well.
I want to add to that if I can, Jason. Can I add to that?
You sure can.
And I want to add a simple, was it Mark or Mike? Was it Mike that asked the question?
No, it was actually Kim.
Oh, okay. Sorry. We haven't ran into anybody that hasn't thought that their data is a mess. Or we haven't run into anybody that we haven't identified a mess in the data. So when you work with a company like ours, not just necessarily ours, it's that company's role to help move through that process. So while you think your data is a mess, it's probably not as messy as you think it is. And those problems are solvable. And we actually do a very good job of identifying exactly where the data is a mess and what needs to happen to overcome it.
Awesome. Well, that's going to do it for the questions. We did have a few more. We had somebody that asked a question for you to expand, Greg, a little bit more on the difference in vision compared to the Project 44s and 4Kites of the world. I know you covered that. We can reach out to that individual directly offline post this webinar, but I thought it was a great discussion. Wanted to remind everybody that we've recorded today's session. It's going to be available on demand. You'll have in the next 24 hours so you can reinforce what you watched today, or if you didn't have a chance to join us, see what you missed. But also be on the lookout for promotions for the next Traverse webinar that will be coming out later in May. But that's going to do it for us today. I wanted to thank Kip, Greg, and Richard for joining us. I thought it was an outstanding conversation. And I actually want to do a shout out to Richard because he found that quote. I think you were at, where were you again, Richard? What conference?
At Realist Supply Chain Conference.
And it tied in perfectly to what you guys do. And we thought, what better topic to host a webinar on, to where we could really talk about Traverse's role in simplifying data and giving that one version of the truth. So special shout out to Richard for bringing the topic to the forefront. And that's going to do it for us today. Thanks again, guys, for the time. Everybody, thanks for joining us.